My clock ticked 10, so I want to welcome everybody to the 36th annual NBER Macroeconomic Conference. So we have participants who are with us here. We are live on YouTube as well. So I welcome all the YouTube people to the program. What we're going to do is our usual NBER macro annual stuff. So please mute yourself if you're not talking. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback sometime. We're going to go 20 minutes for the authors to give their paper. We're going to then immediately go into 20 minutes from each of the discussants. The discussants will go in the order they're listed on the program. And then we're going to go immediately after that into questions from the panelists and people who, even on the YouTube, if you email me some questions, I'll try to sprinkle those in as well. So the authors will not respond after the discussants. We'll go directly into questions, and then maybe a minute or two at the end, the authors could wrap up anything else that didn't get addressed through the questions. We will have breakout rooms after so we have three kind of program blocks today. We have two papers and a panel, 15 minutes in between each of those. And then we're going to go for breakout rooms at the end, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And we're going to have three breakout rooms active, one for each of the papers, and then a general discussion if people just want to hang around and talk about other things as well. So I think that's everything I'm supposed to say. Marty, was I supposed to say anything else? I think that's everything. Okay, so we're going to go into our first paper, and so I'm going to welcome Bob Hall and Marianna Kudlyak to talk about why has the U.S. economy recovered so consistently.
Okay, thanks very much. We have to start, of course, as usual, since Marianna works for the Fed, that the Fed disclaims any responsibility for anything that's said in this paper, and that's probably particularly necessary in this paper. Okay, so I'm going to spend some time presenting the very core of the paper, and then that'll take about half the time, and then the rest of the time I'll go back over some of these, establishing some of these points more fully in terms of evidence. But our first claim is that we demonstrate that the unemployment recovery process is similar in all past 10 recoveries, where it takes the form that the annual reduction in the unemployment rate is stable at around 10% of the current level of employment. So that's the first claim. And the central evidence for this is visible easily to the naked eye if you just plot unemployment, which is the indicator that we use throughout this study. And to make clear that we're talking only about recoveries here, the basic posture of this research is that we have a state variable in a model, unemployment. Something happens bad, unemployment zips up, and we don't consider that process not part of the deal, it's not part of the model. We're conditioning, starting the model at the point where unemployment is high because there's been a recession. And then what we're interested in is the path of unemployment until the next recession. So it's an event-based rather than time-based framework. And you can see that this is log unemployment is very close to a straight line in each case, and with just occasional small blips, plus a pretty uniform rate of decline. So that's really important to this entire research. Our second claim is that recessions involve displacement of large numbers of workers, but that the number of workers and their likely path to personal recovery is totally insufficient to explain the behavior of unemployment after a recovery begins. There's something contagious about unemployment, and tracking down and understanding the contagion is the main topic of the second part of this paper after we take care of these points. And here's one picture that shows the cumulative contribution here that comes from displacement, and the much larger and more persistent bulge of unemployment that follows. So the direct channel of unemployment is certainly there, but it's not, there's a lot of contagion too, which is basically measured by this white area here. The third principal claim is that self-recovery, that is recovery that's not motivated by any outside driving force, occurs in the DMP model without any external force, but the recovery in the DMP model with the standard parameter values, such as Rob's calibration, is way, way, way too fast. And we show a phase diagram, which is actually, I was surprised to discover this, but it's there, it's in Pissarides chapter 1. So this idea that we want to include a phase diagram in thinking about this is very well established, not something new in this paper. And if you compare the actual recovery path, which is shown in orange here, with the models, the DMP models recovery path, you can see that there's just a grotesque difference, a shortfall, and this has been known in the literature, in a well-known paper by Cole and Rogerson that basically explains this in a much more complicated environment. Fourth principal claim is that if you add a feature to the model, which has been added in quite a few different papers for different reasons, that characterizes negative feedback from unemployment to labor market tightness, then that will slow down it alters the differential equation that governs the evolution of unemployment in a way that's consistent. And you can actually simply solve for what that must be numerically in a phase diagram. And it all works out very nicely. Instead of the path of tightness being a horizontal line moving to the left, it's an upward sloping line, not too far away from the point of the orange curve, which is the constant unemployment curve. So that means that this movement up this path is very slow. It takes 10 years instead of 3 months. And that's what you get if you follow this idea that tightness is contingent on unemployment. Okay, so now let's go over. So those are the claims. That's the basic paper. I could stop there, but I have some more time, so I won't. And now we'll go back and first of all try to answer this question of why the U.S. unemployment rate has recovered so consistently. First of all, recoveries are endogenous. There's a natural force within the DMP model that causes job seekers to match with available jobs and lower unemployment. So it doesn't take changes in driving forces to get unemployment back to normal. It's built into the model, and as I mentioned, it's sort of model overdoes that in its simplest form. And the bulge of unemployment created by a crisis at the beginning of a recovery creates a negative feedback to lower market tightness, which endogenously slows that recovery. So that's the basic new feature of the model, of the paper. And the policy implications, which we don't push too hard, but I think is something that we believe, which is that there's little response of unemployment to demand disturbances. Instead, we just follow that path no matter what happens in the economy until there is another crisis. So this is a crisis to crisis model, and we use the crisis to crisis statistical model to leverage that. Now, of course, we're in a recovery today, and you might ask, well, how does today's recovery fit in? And the answer is very differently. We've worked on that, but we're not going to talk about it. So the sample period ends in February of 2020, as far as we're concerned. in studying this process. And we make no claim that that you could easily transplant what we described for 10 earlier recoveries for a recovery that has a very different character that is underway today. Okay, so I mentioned there's two key papers in the literature that we build on. I already mentioned Cole and Rogerson, 1999, that launched this observation that recoveries occur much more slowly than jobs, than people find jobs. And of course, there's been some literature on that, including things that I've written. The other important paper, which involves characterizing the downward slope of that relationship as opposed to the horizontal slope in the phase diagram, is Fujita and Ramey's paper, which identified the high elasticity of vacancy creation as the cause of the problem that Cole and Rogerson had identified, and figured out one mechanism involving a natural one, which is the adjustment costs, and that fits into this framework. It generates a phase diagram that has the same character as I described before. Okay, so then we've done work on statistical work based on this observation. I won't say much about that, except that it involves two approaches. One is building a chronology, and the other is using a hidden Markov. So there's a Markov, there's an event controlled by the switching process, which causes the economy to move, the unemployment rate to jump up. And then what we're interested in that model is not the whole model, but just the piece of it that describes the gradual decline of unemployment until the next regime change occurs. And Jim Hamilton has created the model that we use actually in his original form. From that research, we find great uniformity in starting around 1960 in the slope of the recovery, and in the three earlier recessions, the recovery occurred predictably and along a straight line, but the line is steeper. So it looks like there was one regime change within the regime change process that resulted in a diminution of the rate of decline. So in this, there's a very big literature studying the time series processes of unemployment. Just mention a few of the papers, including this recent paper by Dupraz et al. But we want to make it very clear that we're not making a contribution to that literature. That literature emphasizes that the recovery occurs at a rate that's lower than the expansion. We don't make that comparison. And you won't find anything about rising unemployment. We just don't touch that subject. This paper is entirely about recoveries. And so what we focus on is the extremely slow recovery rate and the uniformity of that extremely low recovery rate, which we take to mean that there's some interesting process not described by the simple DMP model that we could learn from. Okay, so now we ask what accounts for what we call the inexorable recovery of US unemployment. And we spent a lot of time identifying the sources of this initial value of the state variable unemployment. Here's just one picture from that showing the spike of layoffs in the JOLTS data. Okay, but we look at a variety of sources of displacement of workers. You can't add these together, but you can consider them. They're all relatively small compared to the total amount of unemployment. And again, it's one of so this direct contribution is part of the story, but there's much more contagion. So we need to alter the DMP model to incorporate contagion of unemployment. Okay, so here's the Emp model as it arises in our work. The focus is on this differential equation, and we're going to crank this differential equation from a high starting point, and it's always going to go downward. But the rate of how much it goes downward, if this parameter, if this term is well, it's not, no, sorry, this is just the regular differential equation. So this is the standard DMP model. We're going to add a term to this to the differential equation. And then the relationship we look at, normally what's emphasized in the DMP literature is that we have endless study of this P minus W, the present value of productivity minus the wage. We're gonna say no. Let's take that to be a constant. Let's look at how this. So we're going to focus only on the differential equation. We're going to treat initially. We're going to treat theta as a constant. Then we get this phase diagram straight from Pisarides, and this implication which I already discussed. And then we consider feedback from unemployment to tightness. So this is the contagion effect. So we add a term to this theta function, which reduces it by an amount that depends on the unemployment rate. So this is gamma is an increasing function. There's more sort of leaning against tightness, making tightness lower as a result of the presence of unemployment through some kind of effect. So then, first of all, if there is such a function, the function can be computed directly out of the data. So in terms of modifying the DMP model, this is the target. If we're right that unemployment has this negative feedback effect, then we can test that idea by computing how the model would work. And we're asserting that there's a functional relationship described by the blue line, and we claim that that does look a lot like a functional relationship with a little bit of noise. If this idea were worthless, then the blue line, which consists of a very large number of dots, one for each month in a 10-year period, then the blue line would be a scatter. The fact that it's really a line is very strong confirmation of the notion that there is such a function, for something is going on. So there's a function to be discovered here. And we assert that there's actually a very big literature that helps understand this from many different possibilities. And we certainly include Fujita and Ramey, that just appears at the bottom of the slide. But there's lots of other work. Some of it directly aimed at this topic of the extreme persistence of unemployment and recoveries. Not so much emphasis on recovery in this, but then there's people who've written on this subject not aiming at that topic, but nonetheless identifying mechanisms that would fit into this framework. So we don't have a sort of a definitive single model to present at this point, but we do have this, which I think is a very strong indicator of where what to think about, and think about how the extreme difference that in the DMP model in chapter 1, remember that this is a horizontal line. Something is twisting this blue line to make it much closer to the u dot equals 0, and therefore have much less action than unemployment. Okay, so that's the, I think I've said almost everything that's in this slide. But there are other possibilities. The more traditional idea is that the driving force of DMP does change over time, and that means that there's an exogenous mechanism governing the recovery rather than relying entirely on the mechanism identified in the DMP model. So we're moving the DMP model to a more central role in unemployment volatility. And I think I'm just about out of time, so good. If you said, well, what about these other forces? So we write down just a set of forces here. We won't go through them all, but for example, TFP was the standard driving force in the DMP model for years, and people still write models. But the fluctuations in TFP, which are very important in terms of the volatility of, say, GDP, are not correlated with the fluctuations in unemployment at all. The correlation is, especially recently, has been almost exactly zero. So the DMP community is pretty much given up on TFP as a driving force. Other things are there, including papers I've written, but there doesn't seem to be, these outside forces none of them seem to be particularly good explanations for the extreme persistence. So the persistence seems to come internally from the DMP model. So those are our conclusions. We can just very, at the sort of highest level, say, this is a theory of the gradual increase in labor supply that occurs during a recovery, as opposed to what we'd see as the dominant view in macro, which is that the recovery is the result of demand returning to normal gradually over time. So it is a major change in macro theory, if you buy it. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Bob. And that's what you get with a veteran. That was exactly 20 minutes. I don't think you had a second to spare.
Marianna, a lot on that with trimming the slides and
perfect. That's a veteran. Our first discussion is going to be Rob Shimer. Rob will have 20 minutes. Let's go with that.
Bob, can you stop sharing so I can start?
Oh no, I insist on keeping it. There we go. Is that all I need to do? Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so this is a very interesting, provocative, and long paper. They look at a lot of different data sources and try to argue for sort of a fundamental shift in thinking about what the driving forces of slow recoveries are. I'm not going to try to go through everything which is here. There's, I think, 33 figures in the paper, pretty much 33 different data sources and 33 different ways of looking at this. And so I decided that it wasn't going to be a useful discussion to try to summarize all of those different things, but instead to take on this question about why the U.S. recovery have been so stable over time, except for the last one, the current one, and to offer some new or my perspective on thinking about those facts. And I'm going to come to a somewhat different conclusion. I'm not sure we're ready to throw out some of the work that, for example, Bob has done in the past, or that we have strong evidence for this feedback, or really any evidence for this feedback from unemployment to slow recoveries. So Bob didn't emphasize this part so much, but I like the saying, unemployment rises like a rocket and falls like a feather. The falls like a feather part is the part which this paper really focuses on. I'll show you some figures on that. For the U.S., I'm going to show you less than what Bob and Marianna show. I'll say the fact that unemployment declines slowly in the U.S., that's clearly there in the data. Whether it's constant across recoveries, I think, is in the eye of the beholder. And so if you go back to the first 3 post-war recoveries, it was clearly faster. And then we got 6 in a row that were slower. And then they came up with this fact, and then we got hit by a pandemic and the fastest recovery we've ever seen. And so who knows what things are constant and what things are not constant. I'll also look at other countries, and maybe the U.S. is a bit of an outlier on some of these things. So I'm also going to do this quite informally, though. Then the second part of the paper, which Bob didn't talk too much about, is trying to rule out some explanations for slow recoveries. And I think of this as going back to a really nice paper that Bob wrote in 1995 called Lost Jobs. It was a Brookings paper. And I think trying to argue, or one of the conclusions they reach in that part of the paper, is that this sort of explanation that people lose their jobs early in a recession and take a long time to get back into stable employment, that story can't be driving things. And I'll agree with part of that. And the reason is, I'll show you using worker flow data, that the slow recovery of the economy is due to a slow recovery of the job finding rate, rather than the fact that workers keep persistently losing their job. That's there in the data, but it's just not nearly as big. I'll demonstrate this in this here, just in a 3-state model with employment, unemployment out of the labor force. It's also true in a simpler 2-state model. And so that's going to restrict some versions of the lost jobs hypothesis, as it shows in the paper. So following that, what the paper does is just abandons the framework that they're looking at in the early part, and then goes into this long discussion of many different extensions to the Diamond-Mortensen-Casarides framework, and in particular makes this argument that I don't think is really backed up, that unemployment creates a feedback to unemployment, that the fact that there's a lot of unemployed workers means it's hard to find a job. So I'm not going to try to tackle that part. Instead, what I want to do is to offer an extension to the, I shouldn't really say an extension to the lost jobs framework. Bob's original paper had 17 states. And I'm not going to try to extend that to 18 states, but I'm going to offer an extension to the version of it which is in this paper that shows how the basic ideas which are in that framework might be useful in thinking about slow recoveries. And I'm going to interpret this back in terms of Lillian's old ideas on sectoral shifts. So that's the roadmap for what I'm going to do in my discussion. So first of all, this is the recent history of U.S. both recessions and recoveries, and you have the well-known fact that unemployment rises very quickly, and prior to 2020 declines very, very slowly. And these numbers, it is remarkable how smooth those declines in unemployment are during the period, say from 2009 to 2020. And it looks like if we hadn't been hit by a pandemic, who knows how low that number was going to go. It's just inexorably tracking down. When you look at other countries, Canada is kind of a country that looks like the US. I could go a little bit further back in some of these countries, and Canada looks like the US with fast increases in unemployment and slow declines. Maybe not quite so inexorable. You look at Canada in the, I guess, the mid-20 teens, and things kind of slowed down for a while and then got going again. You look at a country like France, and I don't know, it doesn't look to me like this is some inexorable fact about how labor markets function, that unemployment just keeps decreasing. I'd say for France, it's just unemployment just keeps staying high, except for during the pandemic. The pandemic, I think, led to very different responsive unemployment depending on policies that governments pursued, which is also one thing we're thinking about. Differences in policies can mask unemployment and make it show up, for example, as workers who are furloughed from employment but continue to stay employed. For Germany, maybe inexorable declines are there, but it doesn't rise like a rocket, it rises slowly. So different countries, different stories. And I think that's one thing we have to keep in mind, is it's something which is there in the background. Like, it doesn't really matter what happens, what policy is, you're always going to get these inexorable declines in unemployment. Well, countries that pursue very different policies than the US get different results on the behavior of unemployment. So this may not be such an inexorable fact. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about is on worker flow data. And I'm just going to run through very quickly what's it's called a 3-state model: workers moving between employment, unemployment, and non-participation. And I'm going to measure, I'm not going to show you how I do this, but standard ways to measure the transition rate, monthly transition rate of workers going from some state X, say employment, to some other state Y, say unemployment. Using matched CPS files, I'll recover the average transition rates within a month and for the 6 different possible transitions. And then I'm going to evaluate the importance of those transitions to unemployment. And I'm going to do 2 things. One thing I'm going to do is take the 6 instantaneous transitions and just compute at a moment in time what the unemployment rate would be if those transition rates stayed constant forever. So basically what the transitions are telling us we're converging to. And I'll tell you in a moment why I want to do that. But what I get when I do that is the gray line here. The blue line is the unemployment rate in the US that I showed you before. And this gray line, they label UT star, is what the unemployment rate would be if we followed these transitions inexorably out into the future. And the two are very similar. And actually the main reason why they're different here is because of differential selection. I can only look at workers who I can follow from month to month in the CPS for the gray line, and that selects a slightly lower unemployment rate pool. But overall, I would say these flows tell you something about where unemployment is. There is one exception here, again, which is the pandemic, the peak of the pandemic, the second quarter of 2020. The gray line, is way off the chart there, and the blue line is right at the top. That's the biggest gap between these numbers. Okay, so the second thing I want to do is a version of this gray line. So I'm constructing the flows between these 6 different states, but now what I want to do is one at a time, allow one transition rate to vary and keep the other 5 transition rates constant and ask what that steady state would be. And each of these 6 panels, the gray line is that steady state unemployment rate if they were all varying, and the blue line is just allowing one of those things to vary. And so the top left figure is the transition rate from unemployment to employment, how much impact that has on the unemployment rate. And you see, for example, during the Great Recession, this decline in the transition from unemployment to employment pushed up the unemployment rate. And then it led to, as the transition rate from unemployment to employment started increasing slowly, that leads to a gradual decline in the unemployment rate. The bottom, the one below it, the red line below it, that's the transition rate from employment to unemployment. And that also led to a spike up in the unemployment rate and to a gradual decline, but it's smaller in magnitude. The pandemic recession is very different, and that's one reason I want to include it here. The pandemic recession, I think, as we know, a lot of workers suddenly lost their jobs, and this was initially all a story about job loss, not about workers having trouble finding jobs. Now, as you get to the last quarter which I have here, which is the fourth quarter of 2020, you start seeing it looking harder for workers to find jobs. And it's something I'll return to. But there's 4 other figures in here, and it's hard to summarize all of these figures together when you look at all of these. But the other ones actually start to matter. And notably, well, on the red lines, the employment to unemployment figure, which I have here, this is going up from because of employment to unemployment. It's actually going down a little bit because of employment to non-participation. So workers aren't dropping out of the labor force during recessions. They're moving to unemployment. And likewise, unemployment to non-participation flows, those actually decrease during recessions as well. And that pushes up the unemployment in the sort of accounting sense. So when I combine these things and try to just get how much does it matter that workers aren't exiting unemployment? That's what's the top figure here. That really is the bulk of the movements in unemployment. The middle is how much does it matter that workers are exiting employment at a faster rate? They're separating either to unemployment or to non-participation. And you can see this pushes up unemployment by about 1 percentage point, for example, during the Great Recession, and then to 6%, and then it's falling back down to 5% or maybe to 4.5% just before the pandemic hits. And then there's also movements out of non-participation, the extensive margin, the participation margin in the labor force, and that also matters, and actually matters more than the red line does. So we're missing something in ignoring that non-participation margin. But my take from all of this is a take that I've had for many years, which is, with the exception of the pandemic recession, the bulk of the reason why unemployment rises and stays high through the recovery is because the unemployed workers stay unemployed for longer, and that process only recovers very slowly. Okay, so I do all this in a 2-state model. I'm going to skip over that. It's a similar story, but I'll say the 2-state model blows up in the pandemic. It just doesn't produce credible results in the second quarter of 2020. So what hypothesis does this rule out? Well, I want to talk about a simple version of Bob's 1995 paper, Lost Jobs. I want to imagine there's workers who move between 3 states. There's unemployed workers, employed workers who are in unstable jobs, call that E1, and employed workers in stable jobs, call that E2. unemployed workers are all going to transition. The simplest version of this, they all transition into unstable jobs. These are new jobs. You're figuring out whether you're a good match for that job or not. Sometimes you find out you're a good match. Your unstable job becomes stable. That's at rate gamma. And then there's transitions from unstable jobs at a high rate back to unemployment, and from stable jobs at a low rate back to unemployment. And so this is the model which is articulated in the paper. There's sort of 3 different sections, 3, 4, and 5, and a bunch of these 33 figures in the paper that go through kind of explaining the pieces of this model, not quite in these terms, and why it is unable to explain the slow dynamics of unemployment. So I want to try to do it a little faster than those figures. So the basic idea is we imagine that there's a one-time shock, the Great Recession, which moves a bunch of workers into the unemployed state. And to get back, and most of them were in stable employment, and so get back to a steady state of the system, it's not enough for workers just to find jobs again. That's going to be a fast process, but they need to find stable jobs. And if gamma is small, then it's going to be hard for them to do that. It's going to take them a long time to do that. Okay, so the story can explain persistently high values of separation rates. And the reason is the separation rate is a mixture between the separation rate from unstable jobs, S1, and the separation rate from stable jobs, S2. And as you have a lot of workers in unstable jobs coming out of a recession, you get a high separation rate into unemployment. But the bulk of the explanation for unemployment persistence is that the job finding rate is persistent. And in the model, the job finding rate is exogenous and constant. So it's a non-starter. It's not going to be able to explain the bulk of the persistence in unemployment. Now, what's the key limitation here? I want to argue the key limitation is, well, either treating the job finding probability as being exogenous or staying inside this framework is the assumption that the unemployed are all identical. And I want to come back to that point in a moment. Before I do that, I want to say, after going through this stuff in 3 sections and whatever it was, 16 figures, the paper really changes. And what they do, what Bob and Marianna do, is explore a Diamond-Mortensen-Pissarides model, where a key assumption is that workers conditional on their employment status are homogeneous. And then try to explain from that model a slow recovery in the profitability of hiring. And they do this and break down into a couple of different types of explanations. There's exogenous stories about slow recoveries of the profitability of hiring because per period profitability is very low. That's kind of the TFP shock story that Bob briefly talked about. There's also things that I think are really interesting that Bob has worked on discount factors and other papers on credit market frictions that could potentially explain from other driving forces outside of the labor market, let's say, why firms don't find it profitable to hire workers early in recoveries. And then there's a bunch of endogenous stories that they refer to. And each of these, they're referring to a bunch of papers. Each of these things are fleshed out in their own 40 to 60 page paper. There's no way this paper can do justice to each of these stories. There's no way I can do justice to what this paper does on each of those stories. But one of the themes that they reach, and I think here it's where the paper needs more evidence, is that these endogenous stories are really promising. And moreover, that they show that there's some feedback where when unemployment is high, that makes it difficult for firms to hire a lot of workers, and then endogenously creates this low job finding probability. And that's where I don't see that the evidence is really there. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm not seeing what the evidence is for that beyond sort of ruling out other culprits. So I want to bring another suspect back into contention as an alternative to the stories that they're telling here. So I want to extend my little 3-state lost job story in a very simple way. I want to imagine employed and unemployed workers who, in addition to being employed or unemployed, can have 2 statuses. They can be stable employed or unemployed, or unstable employed or unemployed. And the unstable people are going to rapidly switch between employment and unemployment. The stable people are going to switch at a very slow rate, and they're not going to be unemployed a lot of the time. So if you look down at these 4 equations at the bottom, if you didn't have the stuff in red, you would just have a model where type 1 workers switch between employment and unemployment, rates S1 and F1, type 2 at rates S2 and F2 switch between employment and unemployment. But there's these gammas also, and the gammas are things that move around whether you're in stable jobs or unstable jobs. There's a lot of free parameters in here. You should be wary of economists bearing free parameters. Be wary that I'm not giving you evidence in here for any of these things as well. There's more to be done on thinking through whether these types of numbers are reasonable. But the basic idea is I'm going to stick some numbers in here which say these type 1 workers, half the time they're unemployed. And their jobs last like a year, and then they spend a while looking for new jobs. It takes them like another 10 months to find a new job. And then type 2 workers.
2 minutes, Rob. 2 minutes.
Yep. I'm going to get there. Type 2 workers are doing they're in a very different situation. They find jobs quickly and their jobs last a long time. It's like 50 months. These are monthly calibrations. So the result is you get most of the workers in these stable states and there's a 4% unemployment rate. And now I want to shock the model. What I'm going to do is take 10% of my workers who were in stable jobs and move them, or in stable states, and move them into unstable states. And for the employed ones, I'll also dump half of them into unemployment immediately. Half of those workers who moved into unstable jobs. So 5% of workers move from stable jobs to unstable unemployment, and 5% from stable jobs to unstable jobs. Their jobs are at risk. And what comes out of that is a long, slow process of recovery, both the job finding probability and to a lesser extent of the separation probability. And why is this happening? It's because you have a lot of workers who are in these unstable jobs who don't really know how to get back into stable jobs, and they have trouble finding jobs and they lose jobs at high rates. And I want to say this figure qualitatively is like the kinds of figures that Bob and Marianna are trying to hit on slow recoveries of unemployment and being driven primarily by the job finding probability recovering slowly. So what is this story? I just want to, the last minute that I have, put words into what's in those equations. The normal process of job loss for many workers is just not that painful a thing. When a worker loses a job, think about, you're working at a restaurant as a waiter, critics pan the restaurant closes down, you get a new job at another restaurant next door. That's not a hard process for them. It's part of the normal process of employment for many workers. But some job losses are due to other things. The steel industry is going into decline. You're a steel worker. There are no steel jobs that are left. And for those workers, they need to find something else to do. And it's uncertain where they're going to find something else to do. It's uncertain, what sector, what location in the country they're going to find those kinds of jobs. And those are the kinds of sectoral shifts that Lillian talked about. Those shifts are, I think we know, concentrated in recessions. They don't lead to immediate opportunities of going someplace else, but they lead to uncertainty about where those jobs might be. And that's that rapid process of moving between employment and unemployment until workers eventually get a new job. This is consistent with what we know about the fact that losing your job during a recession on average is much worse. It's associated with these kinds of events, not with a restaurant closing, but with the restaurant industry shutting down, or maybe in the pandemic recession with retail shutting down. And so I see, this fast recovery in the pandemic recessions because we didn't go through the sectoral shift. Because for a lot of the economy can come right back doing what it was doing before once the COVID is less of a concern. For some parts of the economy, in particular for brick and mortar retail, I think we're likely to see from here on out these more typical patterns in recovery as workers have to move into other types of activity. And that's the kind of, putting words onto what's in those types of equations. So very interesting paper. I'm not yet ready to conclude that there's some external effect of unemployment that makes it hard for unemployed workers to find jobs.
Thank you, Rob. You can stop sharing. We'll have our next discussion come up. Ayşegül.
Okay, can you hear and see my slides? I think Bob made me nervous about sharing slides on Mac. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss this interesting and timely paper. Even though there's really no bad time to write a paper on unemployment, this is probably the best time. So what is the paper about? Bob and Marianna start with this observation that the US economy recovered uniformly from every recession. And what does this recovery look like? Job destruction subsides, but unemployment remains persistently high. And if you take a very stylized Emp model, like in Colin Rogerson, we find a much faster recovery than what we see in the data. And what they spend a lot of time on is that if you look at job losses at the onset of recessions, these people will find jobs at rates that we observe in the US economy for job finding, so we won't be able to account for this persistently high unemployment. And they have a rather mysterious takeaway that says unemployment itself inhibits the rebuilding process. And then they put some names into this process that creates this negative feedback. And they summarize very interesting papers that focus on different mechanisms, such as congestion or lower matching efficiency or impaired profitability of new matches. So in my discussion, first I'm going to talk about their first fact, this consistent recovery pattern. And what I'll argue is that I see more heterogeneity than uniformity in the recoveries. And then I'm going to leave that aside because I don't think consistent recovery patterns are important for the rest of the paper. And I'm going to revisit Colin Rogerson's paper in a stylized framework. And then I'll talk about key missing margins, two of them, the participation margin and quits and job-to-job transitions that Colin Rogerson already highlighted in their paper as promising extensions. But I want to also add that I had another margin here that I eliminated yesterday. It was about heterogeneity in unemployment risk and labor force histories that Rob just discussed, which I believe is an important part of the missing part of the story. And then I'm going to end with whether there's a big difference between the traditional view and Bob and Marianna's view. But probably what I'll argue is that what the traditional view that they talk about is a simplified version of what we have learned after Colin Rogerson's paper. So let's look at the recovery pattern first. So this is what they have in their paper replicated inexorable recoveries. So when you look at this, we're not looking at recessions because sometimes it's increasing more, sometimes less, but unemployment is always going down. And if you actually start looking at this carefully, you see kind of different slopes within the same recovery, and then you see like there's some part of it where unemployment doesn't go down, etc. So having worked at the Fed, the way I test the slope is to do spider econometrics and put it in a spider chart, because if the slope is the same, they're just going to be on a line. Otherwise, it's going to look like a spider. And as you can see here, there's some spider here. And the pink one, which is the recovery of the Great Recession, is the one that's actually starting as a shallow one and then picking up later. And the pandemic recession is here. It's the one where unemployment rate goes down like a rocket. So what I want to now look at is, I want to look at the first 4 years of these recoveries, because we have spent a lot of time as economists trying to understand this disconnect between GDP growth and the labor market, the so-called jobless recoveries. So how come we're not seeing jobless recoveries if the slope is always the same? So what I'll do is I'll look at the first 4 years and then bring every recovery one by one. This is an early 1958. Some decline, and then there's a little bit of an increase. So this is 1960s. So this is interesting because you see a decline followed by a long period of unemployment not moving all that much. This is 70s. This is actually considered a jobless recovery in Kunders and Rogerson's 2005 paper. You see that the slope is actually shallower. And this is 1970s. It kind of fits in the middle, but there is, again, this kind of slowing down at the pace of the decline. And this is 1980s. What's interesting about this is steep decline follow this period where unemployment doesn't move. And the so-called modern recoveries, 1990s, smaller slope, but it continues to go down. And 2003, the jobless recovery, again, steady but slower decline. And the Great Recession. Bob and Marianna focus on the Great Recession, but it's actually kind of an outlier in terms of how shallow the decline was in the unemployment rate in the first 4 years. And the pandemic recession. I actually don't agree that we should think of the pandemic recession as a completely different recession because unemployment is going down fast. But we are probably missing is other margins that affected these recoveries as well. Starting with the temporary layers. But looking at this, what I see in terms of a uniform behavior is that unemployment, when it doesn't go up, which means there's a recession, almost always declines. But sometimes this progress slows down. And the slowdown seems to happen in the early recoveries after rapid declines. And looking at the pandemic recession and the Great Recession, you can see that the 1980s expansion is actually somewhere in between. So maybe we shouldn't discard the pandemic recession as a different recession, but rather try to understand why 1980s is kind of in between these two recoveries. So my takeaway is that there's actually a lot of rich heterogeneity in the recovery patterns that we shouldn't ignore, because it's going to help us understand why we have at the one side pandemic recovery, and at the other side we have the Great Recession recovery. But I don't think consistent recovery pattern, this rule of thumb about how fast unemployment goes now, is a prerequisite for the rest of the paper. That's what I'm going to talk about next. So Rob skipped this, but let me quickly go over this. Unemployment changes because people flow into it at a rate ST, and people leave unemployment at a rate FT. So this is the two-state abstraction, and the paper of Bob and Marianna only focus on this two-state model. And the steady-state unemployment rate that Rob showed is shaped basically by these two flow rates. And if you have a three-state model, it's going to be richer, but ultimately, whatever model you write, you're going to have an equation like this, because this is how unemployment rate evolves. And I'm going to solve this equation forward, and I'm going to write unemployment in a useful form. So this is unemployment next month. So it's going to depend on the steady-state unemployment rate that is determined by the flows and last period's unemployment rate. But here lambda t is going to be the rate of convergence to the steady state. So if the rate of convergence to the steady state, just like in the US economy, is fast, unemployment is always going to be close to the steady state. So why is this important? So Cole and Rogerson actually talk about this reduced form. They have very different notations, the 90s notation, but ultimately they talk about this equation. And they argue that the model can account quite well for the business cycle facts if there are two things that are satisfied. And I think these are interesting. I read this paper at grad school, and it's like watching a movie and not seeing new things. So the first thing they argue is that it depends on the steady state where the model is fluctuating around. And the second is that this outflow rate, or the job finding rate, it should be around 1/3 for a quarterly model to match business cycle facts. And they're looking at very interesting job creation, job destruction statistics in their model. And now let's look at how this looks in the data. So these are calculated using Rob's method from the CPS. So Bob and Marianna pick essentially this value for the inflow rate. But one thing that we notice is the inflow rate. Even though we are focusing on the uniformity, in the earlier recoveries, we were really not getting much in terms of unemployment recovery, while in the Great Recession, this was helping us. But despite that, unemployment was persistently high, which suggests something that Bob also mentioned, that the job finding rate was incredibly persistently low. And if I look at the job finding rate, this is the value that they pick. Again, one thing that we see is that even though we are talking about one-time shock, neither inflow nor the outflow rate are moving up and down. There's a lot of persistence in both of them. So then going back to Colin Rogerson's point, so the outflow value that we favor is 0.5. That's what Bob and Marianna use. And Hall and Rogerson talk about 1/3 for a quarterly model, which is about 0.10. So now I'm going to start from 10%, just like Bob did. And I'm going to assume that we are back to the basic numbers that we talked about, but unemployment is just high. And then trace the path of unemployment. So what I find is that this is the figure that they have. If I'm converging to a 3.5% unemployment rate, this is going to be extremely quick. But if I'm converging to a 15% unemployment rate, because outflow rate is very low, then this is going to be very persistent. It's going to take about 2 years instead of 4 months. So this is what Colin Rogerson talk about, that there's a tight link between persistent and steady state unemployment in the economy. And this again goes back to Rob's point that if I'm looking at France, then I am closer to an outflow rate of less than 10%. And in that case, convergence is going to be slow. Even if the shock dissipates, it's going to take a while for the unemployment rate to recover. But having said that, we haven't seen 15% unemployment in the post-war period. So why Colin Rogerson argue that this could be consistent with what we are saying? So they are talking about two important issues. One is we're talking about a two-state model, but the world has 3 states. There are some people who are non-participants. So we have to be careful with this, with this mapping. Because even if, when we talk about the inflow rate, it includes people who come from out of the labor force. But when Bob and Marianna look at job losses, they are distinctly looking at people who had jobs before the recession started. So this is an important thing to consider when we are matching it to the data. And the second one is they argue that temporary layoffs and quits are important in trying to match these facts. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Role of participation. We have already seen a decomposition that Rob showed, but essentially now I'm going to look at the 3-state world. And this is coming from my paper with Mike Asby and Bartolome, where we decompose unemployment rate fluctuations into the components that come from fluctuations from different flows. And what we find is that around 2/3 of the fluctuations in the unemployment rate is due to fluctuation of flows between unemployment and employment. So the model, again, is a sort of a model of this part, even though it's mixing up some of the flows going into participation and coming from participation. And then the other 1/3 is about these flows between non-participation and unemployment. So now let's look at this for the Great Recession. So this is the starting from March 2007, unemployment increased by more than 5 percentage points and it stayed persistently high. Now I'm going to show you the contribution of each flow. So this is E to U. This is the one that is easiest to connect to job losses. So this is peak unemployment rate. And even though it's not back to where it started, there is not all that much persistence in it. This is non-participation to unemployment. Marianna talked about people who are coming, who are entering the labor force, but these are those people. One thing is it's delayed. The second is it's more persistent. So a lot of people enter the labor force every day. But if they enter during a recession, they will have more difficulty because it's harder to find jobs. So this is essentially here. But on top of it, there are some people who found bad jobs or who got discouraged, who quit. So this is some process that creates this feedback endogenously, which is part of a three-state world. And this is unemployment to employment. Rob already talked about this. This is by far the biggest contributor. And I also want to point out that this decline in unemployment rate that we have seen did not even come from the improvement in that margin for a long time. And the other is unemployment to non-participation. People who lose their jobs are more attached during recessions. There's also extension of unemployment insurance benefits. So this also keeps unemployment high during recessions. So this is one thing I think we should be very careful about and potentially incorporate into our models. The other margin is quits and job-to-job transition. Why does this matter? So this is a nice paper from Peter Sadlecek's R&D paper. This is showing us origins of hires. The black one, hires from unemployment. And even at the worst part of the Great Recession, this is 1/3. People who are hired from non-participation are even bigger, 45%. And these are people who are hired from other jobs. So the model takes a view that vacancies are posted for the unemployed, and unemployed are the only people looking for jobs. So neither of these are correct. True labor market tightness is not vacancy to unemployment ratio, but it is vacancy to effective searcher ratio. And effective searchers include employed and non-participants, especially some subgroups of non-participants who are discouraged or who actually want a job but have not searched in the last 4 weeks. So I think this is again highlighted in Colin Rogerson. They speculated about this, but this is an important part that we should think about because it also endogenously creates this feedback mechanism. So how does this happen? So now I'm showing
2 minutes, Ayşegül, 2 minutes.
Perfect. U2, which is a narrower unemployment rate. This is the unemployment rate of job losers. The reason I'm looking at this, Bob and Marianna spent a lot of time looking at different measures of job losses. So this is a simple one. So it goes up, and recession ends, it actually peaks, and then goes down. And the blue line is quits. Quits actually tank. They go down like a rocket. And then they start going up slowly. So why is this important? Because this tells me that when, as a firm, I'm posting a vacancy, I'm almost all the time thinking about employed workers, except for recessions. So according to the SEE survey that we developed with Jason Faberman, Andy Miller, and Giorgio Topa, we find that 60% of applications that are sent by employed workers. And 75% of offers made by firms go to employed workers. So if you really want to understand why vacancy creation is not responding fast, or why market tightness or job finding rate is very sluggish, we really cannot ignore employed workers. And as a matter of fact, there's a nice paper by Jan Eckhout and Lindenlab. They compare the traditional tightness, which this paper focuses on, and the effective labor market tightness that takes into employed workers. And the effective one is the solid one. You can see that the movement in that is shallower and more persistent. So this is due to two things. One is the composition of searchers vary over the business cycle. Also, the effective tightness is broader than what unemployment takes into account. So then I want to talk about this temporary layoffs quickly. Temporary layoffs is the opposite because they reduce the number of effective searchers and they increase tightness. So if you want to think about COVID-19 recession, we can actually do it in the same framework, but we better understand on the job search and temporary layoffs better. And going back to this figure, you can see that I'm not seeing this prolonged pent-up quit demand. Quits go down and up. This goes up and goes down. So I don't think there's too much mystery if we take into account these margins of quits and temporary layoffs into our framework. So traditional view versus Holland Kudlyak view, I think the tension is artificial because we are really calling a very stylized framework the traditional view. And I agree with Bob and Marianna, that there are lots of frictions that affect workers who are not job losers. These are labor force entrants. These are the type of workers that Rob talked about. They have to look for jobs every 6 months or so. So they will be always subject to these frictions, and people who try to move from job to jobs. And since most jobs are actually filled by employed workers, if you really want to understand why these things persistently recover, we really need to think about a model where we consider more than 1/3 of the workers who fill jobs. And a side note, I will argue that a model of this sort will not have to treat COVID-19 recession as an outlier. Thank you.